I'm not trying to sell you on this idea in the sense of converting you to it. I want you to play with it. I want you to think of its possibilities. I'm not trying to prove it. I'm just putting it forward as a possibility of life to think about.
Today we're going to explore a few ideas, like why science cannot formulate a theory of everything, why the notion of materialism is not the only possibility for explaining reality, and hopefully we will present and demonstrate an alternative point of view that has as much of a possibility of being true. Firstly, why science has failed to produce a theory of everything. I will give two reasons. Firstly, Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Kurt Gödel was a mathematician, logician, and philosopher who was born April 28, 1906 in Brunn, Austria. At the age of 25 in 1931 he published his incompleteness theorems, which the first incompleteness theorem proves that no consistent logical system of axioms whose theorems can be listed by an effective procedure is capable of proving all truths about the arithmetic of natural numbers. In simple terms, within any system of logic, you can make statements that are unprovable within that system, and therefore we can never know with certainty if the statement is true or if at some point it will turn out to be false. The implication of this mathematical fact is that there are true statements about reality that the scientific method will never be able to prove within its own methodology. But science does not take seriously ideas that are not falsifiable, that do not have the capacity to be proven wrong. Gödel's second incompleteness theorem states that no consistent axiomatic system can prove its own consistency, or inside of a consistent system without contradictions, the consistency of the system itself is unprovable. This implies that scientific reasoning is valid within the logic of the scientific method, but does not prove the consistency of the method itself. These two theorems prove that a theory of everything can be true but unprovable within the scientific method. One thing I can think of about the scientific method that has the potential for being inconsistent is the idea of physical reductionism. That all of reality is reducible to inanimate matter, which at the least is contradictory to observation, especially where consciousness is concerned, as all attempts to reduce consciousness to inanimate brain matter has failed. But where can we go from here if we cannot rely on the scientific method to produce a theory of everything? Well, there's always philosophy, logic, and mathematics. Let's explore the two leading candidates of the day for theories of everything. There is string theory and the multiverse theory as envisioned by Professor Max Tegmark. Firstly, string theory. String theory states that the fundamental substance of reality is matter, and that matter is made of atomic particles, which in turn are made of subatomic particles, which in turn are made of an indivisible particle that is a two-dimensional vibrating strings whose resonance composes the smallest subatomic particles all the way up to visible matter. It is here that I would like to introduce an idea that I will elaborate on further as we continue, and that is that matter is not the fundamental constituent of reality. The idea that there is nothing that has an independent existence outside of your own individual perception, that your mind is the only thing you can prove to exist. This is an ancient Greek philosophy called solipsism, that no one, philosopher nor scientist has been able to disprove thus far. I would urge you at this point to consider the possibility that consciousness is not somehow created from chemical reactions in the brain, that is, it did not arise from inanimate matter, but instead that it is fundamental to reality itself. That it forms the basis of reality. If you don't agree with this idea, just ask and trust your own experience. Can you prove that anything exists outside of your own perception, that is, outside of your senses of sight, hearing, smell, touch, or taste? You can't, can you? And that's okay. If you could, you would be the first person in history. So we see, solipsism is a logical idea that may be true, and I will demonstrate the possibility of its truth in a more radical version as we continue. You see, string theory is still working under the assumption of the reality of matter, of something solid existing outside of your mind independent of your perception, which I will hopefully demonstrate is dubious. Let's take as an example the double-slit experiment.
And here we are, the granddaddy of all quantum weirdness, the infamous double-slit experiment. To understand this experiment, we first need to see how particles, or little balls of matter, act. if we randomly shoot a small object, say a marble, at the screen, we see a pattern on the back wall where they went through the slit and hit. Now, if we add a second slit, we would expect to see a second band duplicated to the right. Now, let's look at waves. The waves hit the slit and radiate out, striking the back wall with the most intensity directly in line with the slit. The line of brightness on the back screen shows that intensity. This is similar to the line the marbles make. But when we add the second slit, something different happens. If the top of one wave meets the bottom of another wave, they cancel each other out. So now there is an interference pattern on the back wall. Places where the two tops meet are the highest intensity, the bright lines, and where they cancel, there is nothing. So, when we throw things, that is, matter, through two slits, we get this, two bands of hits. And with waves, we get an interference pattern of many bands. Good so far. Now, let's go quantum. An electron is a tiny, tiny bit of matter, like a tiny marble. Let's fire a stream through one slit. It behaves just like the marble, a single band. So, if we shoot these tiny bits through two slits, we should get, like the marbles, two bands. What? An interference pattern. We fired electrons, tiny bits of matter through. But we get a pattern like waves, not like little marbles. How? How could pieces of matter create an interference pattern like a wave? It doesn't make sense. But physicists are clever. They thought, maybe those little balls are bouncing off each other and creating that pattern. So, they decide to shoot electrons through one at a time. There is no way they could interfere with each other. But after an hour of this, the same interference pattern is seen to emerge. The conclusion is inescapable. The single electron leaves as a particle, becomes a wave of potentials, goes through both slits, and interferes with itself to hit the wall like a particle. But mathematically, it's even stranger. It goes through both slits and it goes through neither. And it goes through just one and it goes through just the other. All of these possibilities are in superposition with each other. But physicists were completely baffled by this. So they decided to peek and see which slit it actually goes through. They put a measuring device by one slit to see which one it went through and let it fly. But the quantum world is far more mysterious than they could have imagined. When they observed, the electron went back to behaving like a little marble. It produced a pattern of two bands, not an interference pattern of many. The very act of measuring or observing which slit it went through meant it only went through one, not both. The electron decided to act differently, as though it was aware it was being watched. And it was here that physicists stepped forever into the strange, never world of quantum events. What is matter? Marbles or waves? And waves of what? And what does an observer have to do with any of this? The observer collapsed the wave function simply by observing.
So we see that independent of our perception, matter has completely different properties. So is matter particles? Or an immaterial wave? For the purposes of this discussion, we are going to argue that matter's true nature is what it is when not interfered with by our observation, that it is immaterial waves. You see that in this line of reasoning, string theory's assumption of a two-dimensional string particle is not possible because matter has a deeper, immaterial nature. If at this point we consider Einstein's E=mc² equation, we see that the energy contained in matter is the rest energy of a mass. And within this energy is contained all potential states of that given matter, for example, an inflated basketball, and the basketball deflated, and every potential level of inflation or deflation the basketball could exist in is contained within this energy to mass equivalence. So in the spirit of our current line of thinking, matter has an identity beyond its current state. It is equally true that it is every possible iteration of itself in every possible state that it could exist in. It just is what it happens to be in this instance of time, but it is equally true that it is all of its states. Now we will go on to consider Max Tegmark's multiverse. Max Tegmark is a Swedish-American physicist who is a professor at MIT. Tegmark has proposed that the universe is mathematical in nature and has laid out this idea in his notion of the 4 levels of a multiverse. The first level is the universe that we exist in with its set of physical laws that govern its existence. The second level is other universes with different physical laws, universes that had different initial conditions and therefore develop and play out in various different ways. The third level is the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, in which certain observations cannot be predicted absolutely. Instead, there is a range of possible interpretations, each with a different probability. According to multiple worlds interpretation, each of these possible observations corresponds to a different universe. Imagine a dice is thrown and that the result of the throw corresponds to quantum mechanics. All possible ways the dice can fall correspond to different universes. And the fourth level is the mathematical universe hypothesis. Tegmark posits that the external physical reality is a mathematical structure, or that everything has a mathematical reality. This is a physics version of Platonic idealism in which all structures that exist physically have a mathematical basis that transcends the physical.
Let's suppose that you were able every night to dream any dream you wanted to dream. And that you could, for example, have the power within one night to dream 75 years of time, or any length of time you wanted to have. And you would naturally, as you began on this adventure of dreams, you would fulfill all your wishes. You would have every kind of pleasure, you see. And after several nights of 75 years of total pleasure each, you would say, well, that was pretty great. But now let's have a surprise. Let's have a dream which isn't under control. Well, something is going to happen to me that I don't know what it's going to be. And you would dig that and come out of that and say, wow, that was a close shave, wasn't it? Then you would get more and more adventurous, and you would make further and further out gambles as to what you would dream. And finally, you would dream where you are now. You would dream the dream of living the life that you are actually living today. That would be within the infinite multiplicity of choices you would have, of playing that you weren't God.
Now, using solipsism, we can theorize a different mental structure to the multiverse which could be preferred by Occam's razor, the notion that the simplest idea is probably the correct one. Taking the idea that our minds or consciousness are the only thing we can know with certainty to exist, we can argue that level 1 of the multiverse would be your own conscious perception, and that every individual mind is its own universe. Level 2 would be a mind-based version of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, in which every conceivable reality that could be experienced by a conscious observer is equally real. Every possible experience or event involving every possible person would be explored in an infinite number of scenarios, leaving no stone unturned. The third level would be the mathematical universe hypothesis, as every conceivable universe is a mathematical structure. Now at this point we must realize something that Tegmark appears not to, and that is that all mathematical structures are objects of thought. And we can theorize that all thought must exist within a mind, but there are minds that don't exist within our minds, but that there must be a mind that all minds exist within, a truly universal consciousness that experiences every level of the mental multiverse. This is level 4 of the multiverse, which I call the mind of God. The mind of God dreams every conceivable form of conscious experience, and this mind exists as an unconscientious observer in the minds of all conscious beings. The mind of God would hold the totality of reality, that is, every conceivable reality, in its awareness. At the everyday level, the mind of man and the mind of God are one and the same. There is a principle which guides development within the mental multiverse, and that is one of non-familiarity, the notion of counting to infinity, which in turn is governed by 3 principles: the principle of plenitude, the principle of continuity, and the principle of linear gradation. The principle of plenitude states that the universe is full, exhibiting the maximal diversity of kinds of existences. Everything possible is actual. The principle of continuity states that the universe is composed of an infinite series of forms, each of which shares with its neighbor at least one attribute. The principle of linear gradation states that the series ranges in hierarchical order from the barest type of existence to the ens perfectissimum, or God. Now we move on to the mathematics. We are tasked with the question, how do we quantify consciousness? Don't worry, the math is so simple that even a child could understand it. This is an excerpt from a paper originally published in 2000, titled The Price of an Ultimate Theory, in which Nicholas Rescher, professor of philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh, specifies what he sees as the principal properties of a theory of everything. First, he takes as a presupposition the principle of sufficient reason, which in general formulation states that every fact has an explanation. A or fact equals B or explanation, where A equals B denotes that B explains A. Next, he asserts that the most natural construction of a theory of everything would confer upon it 2 crucial features: comprehensiveness and finality. Comprehensiveness denotes that wherever there is a fact, A, B affords its explanation, or once again, A equals B. Finality denotes that an ultimate theory, or A, has no deeper explanation, so that the only conceivable explanation of A is A itself, or that A equals A. Rescher notes that it is obviously problematic to deploy a theory for its own explanation. At the heart of the traditional conception of explanatory adequacy, he says, is a principle of non-circularity stating that no fact can explain itself, but for a theory of everything to be true, the fact would have to be able to explain itself, as we have seen. But is there a way around this? The law of conservation of energy states that the total energy of an isolated system remains constant. It is said to be conserved over time. This law means that energy can neither be created or destroyed, rather, it can only be transformed from one form to another. By using the reflexivity of identity and the principle of sufficient reason, we can naturally deduce that every fact, A, has an explanation, A equals A, so that for all A equals A. The law of conservation of energy states that E equals mc squared, so we can quite naturally assume, using the reflexivity of identity, that for all matter in the universe the law of conservation works reflexively, and that mc squared equals E, and thus we naturally deduce that if E equals mc squared, and mc squared equals E, then we end up with the statement that E equals E, or that energy is our fact that has no deeper explanation than itself, as energy equals mass equals energy, so therefore everything is energy. And we end up with this equation: